How's it going, everybody? My name is Andrew Robson. I'm the bonsai educator at Portland Japanese Garden. I'm a bonsai professional. I spend 365 days a year working on bonsai, creating bonsai, maintaining bonsai, and teaching other people how to do that. And my clients have gone on to win top shows all around the country, win awards with their work that we create together. I'm also the past president of the Bonsai Society of Portland, where we grew the club from just a few hundred members to the largest club in the country with 700 members. And so I kind of live and breathe bonsai every single day, and I'm excited to share this magical art form with all of you. Now, bonsai is unlike other art forms in that a bonsai is a living plant. It's a living kind of breathing thing. And unlike other art forms that an artist kind of sits down, starts a piece, finishes a piece, and then we get to appreciate that painting or sculpture or other form of ceramic or whatnot, a bonsai doesn't have a finish line. It doesn't have an ending. Bonsai is like a sculpture that continues to grow more material, and then the sculptor has to edit that material through time. It's a relationship between a person or a community of people and one particular plant. And that's the thing that makes bonsai special, is it's kind of more of a process-oriented art than it is an art that has a finish line. You can certainly kind of enjoy a tree that's flowering at its peak in a moment in time. Sometimes we bring these inside and kind of show them off when they're at their peak flower, or when they have beautiful fall foliage, or when it just has a nice reworking to it. But bonsai are ever-growing, ever-changing plants, and that's the magic of this art form is editing those plants. So a bonsai can be any type of woody plant, any type of tree, shrub, or vine. You can have trees like maple trees, beech trees, pine trees. You can have shrubs like azaleas, like quince, like winter hazels. You can have vines like a wisteria. Any of those woody plants that creates kind of new woody material each year can be a bonsai, because that woody material is what we use to generate our art form. What we're trying to achieve aesthetically in bonsai is a little bit of nature in miniature. This is a chochibai, a dwarf Japanese flowering quince. And what we're trying to do with this quince, this bonsai, is have it look like a nice, big, beautiful shrub that you might see when you walk through Portland Japanese Garden and see, a plant that's been taken care of by some of our garden department for many, many decades. And I want this plant that's only 2 feet tall or 20 inches wide. I want it to have that same type of visual interest that 12 foot by 12 foot shrub in the garden has. And so we're trying to create nature in miniature. And in bonsai, we have to do a lot of unnatural things to make these look like miniature versions of those natural forms. Some of the things that we have to do is prune the trees. Because a bonsai, we can't leave all of its new growth to have that be proportional to a small plant. I only need a really small sliver of that growth. So when this plant grows 18 inches every spring, I'm going to take that 18 inches and I'm going to prune it back to just a 1/4 inch, because that's the proportions that I need to make this look miniaturized. When branches grow straight and kind of uninteresting, I'm going to take metal wire, bend them around the branches, and kind of move those branches to create forms that mimic the lines of much older branches in plants that we have here at Portland Japanese Garden. Every so often, this is planted in a container, and all bonsai are planted in some type of container, usually a ceramic pot. Every so often, we take these out of the ceramic pots, we prune the roots back about 50%, and we put them back in the same pot with fresh soil to perpetuate the kind of root growth that these continually have. If I leave it in this pot for forever, the roots run out of space to grow, and then they just kind of start to wither and die. So me, the bonsai artist, is constantly trimming the top of these trees, every so often trimming the roots of these trees, and that creates them kind of constantly growing and keeps them alive for a very, very long period of time. A bonsai is an outdoor plant typically. These are trees that are mostly kept outside. There's two problems with growing a bonsai inside. Number one is that we don't have a lot of strong light, which trees need to feed themselves through the process of photosynthesis. And even if you make up for that with some artificial, plant lighting, LED lighting, inside is typically the wrong temperature for a plant. While it might be a nice 70 degrees Fahrenheit for us all year round, which is very comfortable for a human, for a plant that's evolved to need seasons, this tree would feel like it's perpetually in summer, and it would never be able to go into its dormant period to rest. So bonsai are plants that live outside, that we care for outside, that we can bring inside to enjoy when they're flowering, when we're at a seasonal peak, or just to kind of enjoy and create a display in a nice aesthetic form. Now, having a bonsai is a little bit like having a dog. If you can have a dog, you can have a bonsai. Now, what do I mean by that? It's not difficult to have a dog, but it is a change in your lifestyle. And bonsai is definitely a change in your lifestyle. This isn't the orchid or geranium that you have in your windowsill that you water once every 7 or 10 days whenever you remember. This is a plant that needs kind of daily care. Just like a dog might need to go outside to the bathroom a few times a day, needs to get fed multiple times a day. A bonsai is something that needs to be checked on daily because while it might not need to be watered once a day in the wintertime, in the summertime this definitely will need multiple waterings. And so it's a tree that kind of is not, or bonsai is a hobby that's a little bit more active in its plant growth. The other reason that we tend to be active with bonsai is that the work that we do is hyper-seasonal. And if we were going to work on this dwarf Japanese flowering quince today, the work that we'll be doing is pulling off the flowers. And that's a different type of work than when we're kind of trimming the shoots in the summer, when we're wiring the branches in the fall, when we're repotting the tree in late winter or early spring. The work that we're doing now is kind of seasonal, and it kind of changes as the weather for the plant kind of changes. So working on this plant here, what we're going to be doing is I have a bonsai tweezer here with me. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be removing the spent flowers, the flowers that petals have already fallen off or that they're just kind of getting a little bit older. And I'm going to be making space for those new flowers to come in and grow. Here I have a set of flowers that is kind of at its peak, at its prime. You can see even here I have a couple flowers that are just on the precipice of opening. Versus down here, we have a flower that's kind of already opened up, its petals are dropping off. And so these kind of spent flowers, I'm going to take some time right now to remove, and I'm going to leave these nice pretty flowers. Now, I'm not just doing this for the sake of cleanliness. It's not that I love the fact that I'm going to prevent a bunch of petals from dropping all over this beautiful table or my bonsai bench at home, but I'm also doing this for a specific horticultural reason. When you have a flowering plant that creates fruit, fruiting is a big shift in energy away from a tree's growth. And so with a plant like this, if I leave all these flowers on here and a bee in my garden has come in and pollinated all of them, the tree will shift into its kind of reproductive cycle and produce a lot of seed. And I want this tree to continue its bonsai development. I want it to create branches, new branches. And that's kind of counterproductive with it kind of producing and making seed. So what we're going to be doing today is removing those spent flowers, not just for the sake of making the tree a little bit cleaner, but also so that the tree's energy shifts into branch production instead of seed production. And that will just allow me to be able to prune it an extra time or two throughout the year and also kind of focus its energy on development, making this tree better, making it more interesting. So I started this tree many years ago. This was started from a piece of nursery stock, which means it was like something that you go buy at a garden center. And when I started this as a piece of nursery stock, I got it in a plastic, maybe 2-gallon can. It had all these crazy branches that had all these straight lines on it. As your typical nursery stock plant, it didn't have a lot of intention or design kind of built into it, like we tend to want to do in bonsai. So what we did is we cut that plant back to little 1-inch stubs. I had a teacher at the time that specialized in creating this particular type of small flowering quince, or what we call chochibai in the bonsai world. And I had a teacher who specialized in that. He looked at my piece of nursery stock and decided there wasn't much worth saving there. So we cut it back to little 1-inch stubs coming out of the soil. We potted it into a box for several years, a wooden grow box. So rather than spend money on a fancy bonsai pot, we put it into a wooden box that contained the soil to kind of speed up the development a little bit. A wooden box has a little bit more drainage, has a little bit more airflow, so you get about a 10 to 20% speed advantage when you use a grow box. And so when we did that, we put it in that box, it started growing, and you can kind of think of bonsai as an aesthetic 401k. These are plants that require a lot of small contributions over a long period of time to achieve that result. And just like your 401k, how you might contribute a few $100s every month or randomly throughout the year, and over time that grows and you get compound interest and you eventually have something beautiful to retire on. A bonsai is kind of a good aesthetic parallel to that. We do simple things like pluck flowers off at the right time of year, like prune branches at the right time of year. Occasionally we bend branches with some wires. We repot bonsai every 2 to 6 years. And if we do that kind of slow and steady for a long period of time, you can start with something that looks very uninteresting and you can achieve something that looks very beautiful, like this quince has grown to evolve. This tree I started working on in 2008, and looks like 18 years later, we have a tree that was able to go into the top bonsai show in the country, could go into the top bonsai show in the world if it could cross borders and head to Japan easily, and would fit in among kind of some of the best trees, just by doing the right thing at the right time for a long period of time. And so that's the magic of bonsais. You can start with something very humble, a young plant like this, or reset a piece of nursery stock. Sometimes you can go collect a tree from the wild and use that as a start for bonsai. But there's a lot of different ways to start bonsai, but the art of bonsai is kind of through doing these simple things over and over again. And that's where the joy of bonsai kind of comes from. So before we get into creating our new bonsai forest, I just wanted to share with you a few of the tools that we've, one, already used in the video, and two, are going to be using coming up. So the tool that we used in the first part of the video was just a standard kind of bonsai tweezer. These are specially made for bonsai people to have really nice comfortable grip for when you're kind of holding these for hours, and also have kind of nice fine grip where you're plucking off thousands of flowers or needles or leaves or things like that. So a good set of bonsai tweezers is a pretty handy thing for many, many different species that we work with. Now the rest of these tools are actually kind of tools that are centered on repotting. Some of these have multi-uses, but a lot of these tools are for when we repot bonsai. This is a root shears or repotting scissors, and what makes this a repotting scissor is the big kind of wide grip that this has to give us a little bit of extra strength when we're going and cutting thick, heavy roots. It also has a very thick and a heavy kind of blade, so it's just kind of a little bit more durable than the scissors that we use for cutting leaves and branches. It allows us to cut through kind of soil, roots, and a lot of other things. So a good root shear is kind of an essential item for working and repotting bonsai. Another tool that we have that we use quite a bit is a big kind of pruner. This is for pruning big pieces of wood, things that are too heavy for our scissors to prune. We call this a knob a pruner, a knob cutter. Is kind of a concave shape. It's a little bit of a crazy tool, but it's a tool that will release and prune back a lot of wood kind of all in one bite. Next, we have a wire cutter, which is for cutting wire that we'll be talking about later, kind of really cleanly and easily. So we don't want to do that with our scissors to kind of dull our scissor tips when cutting metal wire, which we use to secure our trees during the creation and repotting process. This is a good tool for that. Now, all three of those tools that we just covered can be kind of simplified with a very basic kind of garden shear. This is a shear that you can get at most garden centers. This one's made by ARS, made in Japan, really, really great tool. But this can serve as a tool that prunes roots, that prunes big branches, that can also cut wire. So if you're looking for kind of a multi-purpose tool, if you're just getting started in bonsai, this is a great kind of one tool that can do many, many things. And then to bend and tie down wire, I have a pliers to just give me a little bit of leverage and be able to kind of pull excess a gap out of there to get things secured and tightened really nicely. Another kind of essential tool for repotting is just a bamboo chopstick. These are chopsticks that you can get at your favorite, nice Japanese restaurant. You do want to get ones that are bamboo rather than pine, which a lot of the cheap restaurants are switching to these days, because the bamboo has an incredible amount of strength, and so these will be really durable. This is something that we use to sometimes secure trees and tie wire over, or sometimes we use this to kind of press and chopstick in our soil as well. Lastly, a couple supplies that we have a cut paste. So if I do major pruning on branches or trunks, I tend to put a cut paste on. This is like a liquid Band-Aid that goes over those cuts to prevent disease or pathogens from getting into those plants and harming them. It also has a little bit of growth hormone in there to expedite the healing process on those plants. And finally, we have some aluminum bonsai wire. This is just kind of aluminum wire that has been kind of specially made for bonsai that will allow us to either wire the branches on trees, as we talked about with the chochibai previously, or as we're going to use it in the forest part of the segment, to secure the screen and maybe even tie down some of the trees themselves. So these are kind of our essential tools that we'll be using to create our bonsai forest. The other thing that we'll cover before we start creating our bonsai forest is the type of soil that we'll be using. Now, for bonsai, we use a different type of soil than what most container plants use. Most container plants will use organic soils that are, composted bark, sphagnum peat moss, things that kind of have a short lifespan. But since bonsai can be alive in pots for many, many years, several decades, even many centuries, we need a soil that's going to be sustainable and not break down over a long period of time. And there's two components that we like to use for bonsai soils. One of those is akadama, which is a volcanic clay. It's this brown particle that you see here. And this akadama, this volcanic clay, is a particle that the structure of it will start to break down a little bit, but as it does, it creates really, really fine root growth. And as that volcanic clay, the akadama, breaks down, we tend to splice in a little bit of pumice or perlite, which is this white particle, to allow space for water and air to get into that soil mass as that akadama is breaking down. So both of these are volcanic particles. The ratio that we use for bonsai is typically about 2/3 akadama to 1/3 pumice or perlite. And that is just going to be a great soil mix to grow both young trees that are in development as well as old bonsai that are kind of been in training for a very long period of time. For our soil project, what we're going to be doing is using dry soil, which is what we normally use in bonsai when we're repotting, so that the soil doesn't kind of crush when we go to chopstick it in. So we'll be using dry soil for the bottom of the pot, but we're actually going to wet the soil down and use wet soil to help hold the multiple trees in place for when we go to create our forest planting. So you'll see a mixture of this dry and wet particle, but it's all the same kind of substrate, that akadama, which is the brown volcanic clay, and the pumice or perlite, which is that white volcanic rock. the last thing that we're going to get together before we assemble our bonsai forest is get our container situated and prepped. So first of all, this container that we're using is a Japanese bonsai pot, and it's quite an old one. This is probably a 50 to 100-year-old vintage ceramic pot made by a group of potters in Japan in the Tokoname potting village. The reason that the village is established there is because it has really wonderful clay. So for generations, they've been making wonderful ceramics in Tokoname. And so this pot comes from a kiln in that region, and it's starting to actually get some really nice patina on it. This was a cream pot, so just kind of like a plain dull white pot when it was made. But the kind of blacker kind of stains on this pot, so to speak, is patina that's developing from this tree having, or this pot having water splashed on it for many decades, fertilizer, dirt, kind of all these things. So this pot has a nice little bit of age to it, which is kind of fun. So to prep this pot, we're going to use a few materials. I have some screen that I will be placing in the bottom of the drainage holes. So you can see that all bonsai pots tend to have several holes drilled in them for drainage to allow water to fully saturate the soil, but any excess water to spill out of the bottom. So I'll be using this screen to cover up those holes to prevent any of my soil from falling out of them. And so this is just a bonsai screen that we get. I'm going to take a scissor. I'm going to cut this screen and cut different segments out of this to get these holes prepped. Now that we are getting several of these screens kind of in place, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my aluminum bonsai wire to help secure the screen. So I'm going to cut pieces of wire for that using my wire cutters. And I don't need really long pieces. I'm using pieces that are about kind of 2 inches or so to help secure these screens. We're going to do a very simple method to secure these. This is kind of what some people just call the staple or the spring method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the wire and bend it around my finger. These drainage holes are about the size of my finger, so I can use my finger as a rough estimate for size. So I'm going to take that wire, bend it around my finger to create kind of a U shape, and then I'm going to take that U shape, I'm going to insert it through the drainage hole, and then I'm going to press down to keep pressure on that wire, while underneath the pot, I'm going to bend that wire underneath. And so I'm going to do this on all 4 of these holes. I'll show you what that looks like underneath. But I'm basically creating a little tiny spring, which is going to help hold these screens in place so that, soil or anything isn't going to kind of shift this screen or move it around. So we'll do that to get all these screens secured. And again, these screens are to prevent our soil from flowing through our drainage holes. But we love having these drainage holes in our pots because they allow excess water to escape from the pot and not damage our roots after watering a bonsai. Typically, a bonsai pot will, at its minimum, have about 2 holes. At its maximum, it could have up to 10. So somewhere around there. So we're going to get the rest of these screens intact, which is going to get this pot nicely prepped for our purposes. And then after this screen is intact, then we will go around and start getting our trees prepped. Bonsai is a little bit like cooking. When we're working on a bonsai, when we're repotting a bonsai, I want to do all of my prep work ahead of time so that when I have my trees that are kind of bare rooted, all the soil away from the roots, I'm not kind of leaving them out as long as I can. I'm kind of expediting that process so they can get those roots around moisture pretty quickly. So we like to do all of our prep work kind of ahead of time, and then afterwards, when we're going to assemble this forest, we have things all kind of lined up ready to go. So the last step here is to flip the pot over and cut the excess wire off the bottom. So I'm going to use my wire cutter again to come in and snip the excess length of the wire. We only need about somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch of that wire on either side of the drainage hole. So I'm just going to remove the excess. The reason that we do remove the excess is so that we don't have kind of, when I go to lift up this pot, I don't want to kind of nap my finger with the wire. If we're pushing this on a bench in the garden or something, I don't want it to snag. And so I just want to kind of get a minimal amount on there to function, but not any excess. Now for the forest that we're creating, we are not going to be tying it down with wire like we traditionally do for repotting a singular bonsai. But when we're creating a forest, because we're going to be putting in 7, 10 trees, something like that, I'm actually going to use the weight of wet soil to help secure them down. So at this stage, we are not going to add any additional wires. If I was repotting an already established bonsai, I might add in some extra wires through these drainage holes to be able to tie and secure down the tree's root systems. But because these trees are young, we don't need to do that. This is kind of all we need to do to get this prepped and ready for our forest composition. Now we are going to assemble our bonsai. This is a bonsai that I've never put together before. This is going to be kind of day one of a new bonsai in existence. So what I have here are a bunch of European beech seedlings. These were just kind of young trees, saplings that I plucked out of the ground at the local elementary school where after talking to landscapers, they just kind of mow these things out anyway. So I was able to collect a bunch of trees with permission from the school to kind of start with. And that's, like I was saying earlier, one great way to start a bonsai is to use kind of young material. Now, the benefit of creating a forest planting where we have multiple trees in the same container, not attached at the base, is that you have many trees that are kind of contributing to the silhouette of fine branches. And when you have that, you can actually create something that looks a lot more interesting in a much shorter period of time. So forest plantings have a little bit more visual interest in and of themselves, but also are a kind of more expedited way to make an interesting looking bonsai. What we're going to be doing with these saplings are kind of pulling them out. A year ago I collected these. I just kind of planted them in a plastic kind of container at home with some, whatever soil, just to kind of get them established. I cut the taproot at that time. Now what we're going to do is kind of prep them to get them ready for making a forest. So I'm going to take these trees out of their kind of soil, and if I look at these trees, that taproot was kind of originally cut on these, but they have a lot of fine roots that are now coming out. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of pruning on the top of the trees to kind of get them situated. Now with a forest, we like a few kind of straight-ish trunks that are kind of in the center that kind of anchor the composition, but a lot of the smaller trunks that are on the perimeter of our forest tend to have a little bit more direction and movement. And so this will be a great kind of side tree because it's got really nice direction that's kind of launching off to one particular side. And so the branch that's kind of growing back in, I'm going to prune off because that's just kind of growing counterproductive to how this would grow if it was influenced by the growth of other trees. The other thing I'm going to do is just kind of prune off some excess length on some of these branches, just things that are a little bit too long for us. When we're adding so many young trees in together, the mass of branches to start with is going to come from many trees, so each individual tree doesn't need to have a lot right now. I also want to fit things in really nicely, and if I have less branches, that's a little bit easier to do so. So we have this tree kind of mostly prepped and ready. I'll do a little bit of pruning with my root scissors on some of the side kind of roots to get those kind of reduced so that I might be able to tuck this in really closely. But that's really, on a very young sapling, that's about all of the root that I really need for a young plant. Now, if this was a 30, 40, 50-year-old beech tree, that would be way too little. But a young tree with not so many branches that has a lot of strength and vigor, this is a perfectly kind of adequate amount. So I'm going to go through and kind of get each of these trees individually prepped before we start playing with our kind of forest. So taking all of these out, kind of spinning them around to see which way does the tree flow. And I want to have branches that are kind of growing with that flow. So taking pruners and pruning off things that are maybe growing backwards. So this tree here, it's very subtle, but this tree here has a just slight lean to this side. And so with just that subtle lean, that's enough of an indicator for me to kind of remove the branches on the one side. This will be placed so that it's just kind of leaning out. We're trying to kind of simulate phototropism, where plants kind of grow towards the light. And so this will be a tree that's kind of growing outside of a bigger tree, kind of trying to find its own little space for light. So a bonsai forest in its growth will eventually get that, but when we're setting one up for the first time, we kind of help simulate that in the meantime. And then what we'll do is we'll prune back some of the roots just like we did before, using our root scissors. All right. This is one of our larger, more main trees. And so we will kind of come in, get some of these excess branches kind of pruned off here. Now, this might actually be too tall of a tree for what we're looking for. So I might come in and reduce its overall height a little bit using my kind of big pruner. So kind of just editing these trees for how they will feel. I'm just kind of assessing each one, kind of determining where my flow might be on them, where is the direction that they're leaning, pruning off any conflicting branches that they have, and then reducing my roots as well. Repotting is one of the messier things that we do in bonsai. Most of our bonsai work tends to be a little bit more maintained and clean, but repotting is one of the messy things that we do just because we're really kind of getting our hands dirty, kind of pruning the roots back, understanding what's happening with the root system, and making good decisions to set these up for really good growth. So that one looks like it's nicely situated. For now, for starters, I'm doing a fairly rough edit to kind of get a lot of these things started. And then what I'll be doing is, as we assemble the forest, I'll be coming in and kind of doing a secondary kind of, final draft pruning session to kind of help get the trees a little bit better seated together. So this is a smaller tree, meaning the trunk is thinner in caliper. And so I don't want this extra height. I don't want this smaller tree to be as tall as my main tree, because logically in a forest, our thickest trunks should be our tallest trunks. So this one having a thinner sized trunk, having a smaller sized trunk caliper, I'm going to actually reduce the height of it quite a bit, probably at least 50% off of there, and then we can come in a little bit on some of these other side branches so that its trunk size kind of matches the height a little bit more closely. Then we'll do a little bit of root pruning as well to get these all situated. Again, just like cooking, having a lot of this prep work done allows us, when we go to actually do the assembly, to be pretty quick and allow us to just kind of focus on that. So next step will be, this is a slightly thicker sized trunk, so we can retain a little bit more of the height. Now going into the pot that we set up, I don't need it to be obnoxiously tall, so we will make a little bit of reduction on the height here. But that's kind of a nice size for one of our kind of main or larger trees in the composition. We'll come through, we can use a chopstick, and we can kind of use that to kind of rake away some excess soil. Make sure we're getting these pruned back kind of nicely and set up for the bonsai pot. What I'm looking for is roots that are kind of growing a little high on the plant. I want to have on a young plant roots that are kind of all coming out on the same level on the trunk. And when you have young plants that have tap roots, they have roots that come out kind of all along that tap root. And so when we pruned that tap root 1 year ago, we got a lot of roots to fork along the trunk. And so here's kind of one big thick one a little bit high up. So what I'm going to do is remove that thicker one. And you can see not too many root mass came off with that, but remove some of those bigger ones. Here's another one that's kind of riding about an inch higher than any other root that we can remove. We kind of do this in stages so that we don't end up taking off every single root on the tree with one cut. But that's a nice amount of root mass kind of for the tree that we're going with. We'll get this kind of cut back, situated. And that'll be kind of a good kind of secondary main tree. Looking the next, this one's a little bit thinner and has quite a bit more movement. So the movement on this one is suggesting that it's going to be kind of a smaller tree off to the side. What we'll do is we have it fork into a group of 3 trunks here. And so with these 3 trunks, I want, where it forks into 3 segments, I want to kind of choose 2 of those. So I'm going to keep like the 2, one that's growing kind of fairly upright, one that's growing off to the side. We'll get rid of the smaller kind of upright one. For the upright one, we'll knock back a portion of it, and then we'll also prune back a little bit of the side. So we'll end up with a tree that's kind of nicely growing off to the side. We can carry on with our root work here, get a few of these long kind of thready roots cut back. When we prune roots on a tree like a beech, where I'm cutting, the roots will fork and create new roots. Just like when we prune a branch, it will fork and create new branches from that pruning spot. So lastly, we will take our last tree, which is also a tree that has a little bit more movement based on a cut that was made in the past on this tree. So I want to reduce some height. I don't need this to be a fairly big tree in the composition. So we'll get this kind of pruned back a little bit more. We'll prune a little bit more roots off here. And then we should be nicely prepped with these trees for starting to figure out some assembly. Now this one has roots that have forked really nicely higher up on the trunk. I have a tap root that's kind of visually exposed down low. So I'm going to take my knob cutter, that big crazy tool that we looked at earlier, and I'm going to cut that tap root off of there to get that kind of excess wood kind of removed so I can sit this a little bit lower in the container. So now that that's gone and we have all our trees prepped, we will kind of get our trees kind of together. Get these off to the side. And we will bring up our forest pot to start playing with a little bit of arrangement. How we arrange a bonsai forest is pretty scripted. We've been making forests in bonsai for the last about 100 years or so. And with those forest plantings, we've learned a lot of things about where to place certain trees, bigger trees, smaller trees, to create arrangements that look a lot more realistic and natural in a small form. Like I was saying earlier, we have to do a lot of unnatural things in bonsai to make these appear natural. And the placement of some of these forest trees are part of that, where we don't necessarily have a direct copy from nature, but we kind of use some cues from nature and do some unnatural things to give this the appearance of that natural image. So I have my forest tray sitting in just like a metal cookie sheet. And what that cookie sheet is going to do is just kind of protect my table, because we are going to use a little bit of wet soil. So rather than have water flow onto our table just to prevent this from being a mess, we'll do this forest planting in a small tray to just capture some water. But how I'm going to get started is I'm going to take some of my dry soil first, and I'm going to add my dry soil to the pot and create kind of a base layer. If my pot is 3 inches deep, I'm going to add this in the bottom inch of that pot, or the bottom third of that pot, just to kind of have soil underneath the trees that I'm placing, so the roots there can grow into that soil. And again, this is my soil mixture of akadama, which is a volcanic clay. Akadama in Japanese literally translates to red ball. Aka is red, dama is ball. So these little red balls of volcanic clay. And then the white particle that's in here is perlite, or a kind of volcanic rock. Could also use pumice. And I'm going to use my hand to kind of pat this down flat, kind of get my base layer established in this bottom third of our ceramic bonsai container. And then I'm going to look at my plants, and I'm going to kind of grade my trees a little bit. I'm going to start with my thickest tree, which is going to be the main tree in the forest. And my main tree, I want to kind of have that position established first. Now, if you look at our bonsai pot, we have kind of a long, skinny bonsai pot, which is a great shape for a forest. This is maybe a slightly awkward shape for a single trunk tree because the proportions are it's really skinny for its width. But for a forest where we're trying to create more of a scene, that kind of long horizontal stretch is really nice for kind of providing that horizon line on a forest. And what I'm going to do is to also create a little bit more of a scene rather than have the forest planting have all these, how many trees do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 trees. Have these 7 trees kind of planted towards one side and leave one side fairly empty. Because we have so many trunks going in here, I want to give my eye a little bit of visual relief in this container so that we have kind of this dense space and then we can relax and have a little bit of free space. That free space that we'll leave in the pot, which might be 50 to 30% of the pot unutilized with trunks, also makes it look a little bit more realistic and like a forest in miniature rather than just a bunch of trunks in the pot. So I'm going to start with my main tree. As we talked about, I'm going to spin this around and kind of see its orientation. We're going to create a forest that flows to the right, so this way. And I'm going to take my main tree and I am going to situate it towards the front of the pot. Typically with a forest, the thicker trunks will be more forward in the pot. The smaller chunks will be a little bit further back in the pot, and that will just allow the composition to have a little bit more depth and kind of visual feeling to it. So typically our thickest trees go towards the front, our smallest trees go towards the back. With our main tree, that typically resides about 1/3 of the way in from the pot. So we're going to get this kind of established in here so that it's sitting kind of nicely and just has a really subtle kind of flow. I want to kind of make sure I can see some of the branches that I have that I'm keeping, but also kind of have it have a nice kind of lean and angle. So we might place our main tree there. Now, I'm using trees that are all technically the same age. Over time, if we come back and visit this tree in 20 or 30 years, all these trunks will be radically different in their trunk size or their thickness or caliper. But for today, they're fairly similar. Something I can do today to make some of these trunks appear larger is have them spaced close together. So if I take another kind of thick trunk, kind of main tree, and I have that kind of very close visually to my other tree, if we have the room in our root space to do this, if I have these close together, it kind of makes this appear like it's a little bit thicker. So we can play with some of these kind of visual cues to make our trunks seem like they're a little bit bigger than they necessarily appear. If we have these trees like this, which I think is a nice kind of pairing for our 2 main trees, then maybe we reduce the height of our second tree just a smidge so that we create a little bit of difference in our trunks here. And then how we're going to tie these down, like I was saying, was not with bonsai wire like we would normally do when we have a lot of roots to play with, but we're going to use wet bonsai soil to kind of tie down and anchor these trees. When you wet soil, it gets about 5 times the weight of when it's dry. And that weight that it has when it's wet will kind of help hold these trees in place and kind of anchor them. So I have some wet soil here. It's my same exact mixture that I was using before, about 2/3 akadama, or volcanic clay, about 1/3 perlite, or volcanic rock. And I'm going to put that wet soil on top of the roots just to kind of help hold these in and kind of situate these. Now, we can start playing with some of our smaller trees in the forest. So, typically, now that we have our 2 thickest trees in, I'm going to choose my kind of next larger trees and place these kind of maybe off to the side a little bit to give a nice kind of flow and feeling. And just like we paired 2 trees together, I might do the same thing kind of off to the side. Maybe these 2 trees sit really well together this way. Where, again, having 2 trees together makes them feel like they're just slightly larger. So these will be just a little bit further back from our main tree. What I'm going to do is do a little bit of pruning on branches now that I'm seeing these trees together. Like I said, this is our what was our rough draft before is now getting a little bit more finalized. So seeing how these trees kind of sit together, I'm just going to do a little bit of pruning on here. And then I can use my wet soil, once I'm happy with how they're placed, to kind of lock and hold these in. You can see just adding a scoop of that wet soil makes it so I don't have to hold these together very well. Yeah, they can kind of stay there. The other benefit of the wet soil is it allows me the flexibility. If I don't like where this is sitting, I don't have it wired into place. I can move this around, I can bend it. If I want to change orientation on a tree, I can do that and kind of repack in some soil. So that wet soil just kind of allows me to play a little bit more. So since we have 7 trees, and the number 7 is important on a forest planting, we want to use odd numbers of plants under 10. If I use 4 plants or 6 plants or 8 plants, our eye, like the 4 plants that we have in here right now, can very easily kind of pick up on the pairs. Versus if I just add one more tree to our forest here, it gives it kind of a little bit more of a natural feeling, a little less human, a little less symmetrical. And so under 10 trees, our eye can really pick up on even numbers. And to make this feel a little bit more natural and more like a forest, having 5 trees or 7 trees, as we're going to add, provides that little bit more of a natural feeling. The other thing that we'll do is because these are kind of set up in 2 kind of mini pods. I have a pod of trees here and a pod of trees here that we're going to continue to build off of. For a 7-tree grouping, I might have 4 trees on my main pod and 3 trees on my smaller pod to kind of break that up a little bit into smaller subgroups. So we have 3 more plants to play with here in our forest of various sizes. So where we roughly placed this tree, that's actually sitting really nicely. Again, it's a smaller tree, so we're going to put it towards the back of our composition. And because we have 2 trees that are close here, having 1 tree that's a little bit more spaced out is nice visually. So this one, these 2 are kind of close from the side. This one a little bit more spaced out from the edge. Again, the way it's leaning is really important. So how it's kind of having a slight flow outwards kind of simulates the phototropism that this tree would have. Where it's kind of growing towards the light. It doesn't have access to light underneath this main tree, so it's going to grow outwards to get access to light on the perimeter. So again, I'll scoop some wet soil on there to help hold this in place. And then we can start to think about our remaining 2 trees that we have. One other thing that we can do is these 2 trees are close together, but there is a little bit of a gap in between them. And one position for my one of my last trees might be to actually have it be just in between these 2 trees. So from a glance, it might look like it's 1 tree kind of at the base, but they kind of flare out on top. So this could kind of go in the back here, kind of right in between those 2 trunks as a possible kind of grouping. What I'll do is kind of referencing from the front, I'll come in and just see if I'm happy with that, see if we have any kind of slight orientation to make from that. We could also have it be a little bit off to the side. And I think that gives a little bit of a nicer feeling in this case, just because it has a little bit nicer contour with our main kind of trunk. So we'll get this one locked in with a little bit of soil. Bonsai are a little bit weird in that they're both 3D and 2D objects. You're watching this video in 2D right now. So, and when bonsai are photographed, they're in 2D for exhibition catalogs. On Instagram, they're in 2D. And actually the way that we design bonsai is from a specific front where we look at it almost in 2D. But they also have to look good in 3D. And so I want to line things up and keep referencing from my front of the pot, which is here, while also making sure that, all the trees aren't lined up from the side, or, so it's kind of two reference points for bonsai to make sure that they look good from all different angles. Now we're going to place our last tree. Liking the way this composition is coming. Maybe somewhere in between our two groupings, still closer in our second group is nice, but somewhere in between. Now that looks good from my front, but when I look at it in 2D, one of my trunks is kind of flaring inwards, so might spin it around to have it flare outwards. We'll do a little bit of pruning here to make this make sense a little more. And again, I'm going to have that trunk a little bit more towards the back of the composition. Using this wet soil to help hold down and situate everything. And this whole time, I've been really careful to leave the right side of the pot kind of unoccupied. By having my trees concentrated on the left side of the pot, what I've done is I've created a little bit of space here that it's going to kind of give us the visual relief that this needs. When you have so many trees and it's having a little bit more complex design on the relationship of how these trees are working together, having this negative space, which the Japanese call ma, is nice to have that kind of rest after seeing a little bit more visual confusion. So we'll check our tree from our front again, make sure things are flaring out nicely. Now, one of the nice things about this wet soil is if I do need to make an adjustment, I can kind of do that, flex it with the soil that it has. But that's kind of a nice arrangement of my main trees, both from the front and in 3D, especially from the sides, to where I don't have a lot of trees lining up from the front. I can see every single trunk from my front. From the side, I have my main tree more forward, a lot of the smaller trees kind of working towards the back. And that's kind of a nice rough placement for, I think, how this is going to fit together today. Now that I have my trees kind of roughly placed, they're kind of pruned to fit together well, we'll finish this off by getting some dry soil to fill in a lot of the gaps that we have in this pot. So the wet soil is going to really help anchor and secure all of these trees down. And after we repot a bonsai, what we typically do is take this over to the hose, get it watered in really nicely. At this point, what I can do is I can use a chopstick, a restaurant chopstick, to kind of come in and kind of fill some spaces where there might be a little bit of space of air between the roots. So I'm just going to use my chopstick to kind of press the soil in between the roots really gently. Allow that soil to kind of wiggle down and get situated in there. When I water the tree in, a lot of that will help settle as well. But forest plantings are a really fun way to make something interesting with very humble material. Like I said, I got this material for free. I am using a nice bonsai pot to put this in, but you could put this into a wooden box if you didn't have a bonsai pot, or if you wanted to get kind of a plastic bonsai training pot, you could use one of those as well. But you can get something that looks kind of visually really interesting with very humble material out of just, a few seedlings from that you collect in your local neighborhood. So I'm going to get a little bit more soil on here. We're going to tap down all that soil, and then we should have a completed forest planting. I can also use my hand to kind of pat down and press some things together. I'm filling the soil up. It can be slightly mounded where the trees are, but kind of the rest of the place, I want it to be just kind of just underneath the lip of the pot, so that water can hit the edge of the pot and roll into the pot rather than kind of roll over. So I'm okay to mound it up a little bit where the trees are, ever so slightly, because I really want to make sure it's holding those trees down really nicely, pressing down on all those roots. But where we have negative space or towards the edges of the pots, that's where we'll be a little bit more careful that it's just sitting below the lip of the pot. I'm going to use my hand to kind of pat things down level, get the soil kind of situated on there nicely, lock some of the particles in before we go to water this. I've been making forest plantings for quite a long time. In fact, the first forest planting I ever put together was a beech forest in 2010 in high school. So 16 years later, I went from plants that were almost identical to this, maybe they were even a little bit smaller. In 16 years of kind of pruning, shaping, wiring it, caring for it, watering it, repotting it. 16 years later, I went from a very humble origin to a tree that can get into a top kind of exhibition. And so that's one of the benefits of forests, is it's a great way to kind of get started with bonsai and have something interesting pretty quickly. So we'll just get the rest of this soil kind of tapped down. Once that's all kind of situated, I'll check and make sure my trees are still oriented the way that I intend them to be. Just make sure nothing got bumped around, which is easy to do. So we'll check it, make sure our trees are still nicely placed, nicely situated. If we need to make little adjustments, the wet soil allows us to nudge that along. But I think that's looking pretty great. So we want to do this type of work. We're recording this video in March, but the time of year isn't important from a calendar standpoint, but it's more important based on when the trees are growing. So these beech trees, the buds on them were just beginning to swell and push, just beginning to wake up from winter dormancy. You can repot trees right at that time as they're kind of waking up from wintertime, as they're starting to swell in the spring and get ready for their spring growth. When you see the buds swelling, that's your kind of ideal time to repot a bonsai. And so this is kind of perfect timing. These trees are just waking up. In some northern climates, that could be kind of March, April. For southern climates, that could be January, February. But we want to repot things kind of as they're coming out of dormancy. The last thing that we can do is get a little cut paste on some of these cuts that we made. But we'll wait to do that after we get this watered in. So yeah, the last thing that we would really do on this is just water this to get all the soil saturated, get any dust from the soil particles to wash out of the drainage holes. And then we have a planting that's kind of ready to go. Aftercare for a tree like this will live in a greenhouse for a few months away from the wind to prevent the trees from kind of blowing over. And then after a few months, the roots will have kind of grown together, sowed their way into those soil particles that they'll be nice and stable. So that's a completed beech forest planting with European beech seedlings. Now that I shared a little bit about what bonsai is, now that we've created a bonsai from scratch, if you want to get started in bonsai, if this interests you, if this is something that you feel like you want to take on, one of the best ways to get started in bonsai is by joining a local bonsai club. Here in Portland, we have the largest bonsai society in the nation, but pretty much everywhere in the country in North America where there's a major airport, there's a bonsai society. And even if there's not a full bonsai society, there's a group of people who are doing this. You can meet on Facebook groups, you can meet on Reddit. There's a lot of different ways to kind of meet and engage with people. But bonsai is something that's best kind of done with other people because a lot of the things that we're doing are really tactile with our hands. And so having someone show you that in person is one of the best ways to kind of really get started with bonsai. So if you want to get into this, I recommend joining a local bonsai club, traveling to a bonsai teacher like me. I offer intensive classes where you can come kind of learn how to do this in person, and many other bonsai professionals do as well. Or coming and seeing bonsai at the Portland Japanese Garden on display is a great way to just kind of see and experience them in person to kind of start your bonsai journey. Thanks for tuning in for this episode. I hope you learned some great things about bonsai, and I hope you're eager to get started with some bonsai of your own.